Language and its many parts. Language is something that is ever-changing and evolving. It is either bringing in new words through borrowing or getting rid of words that are no longer in use. This screencast covers the imminent knowledge that native speakers have with language, different types of communication, the difference in first and second language acquisition, parts of the brain involved in speech, and misconceptions with electronic-mediated language and dialects within a language, among other things. Native speakers know several rules to their language without being taught it because they grew up speaking it. Native speakers know that having more than two consonants together in most cases is not a sound we make in English. For example, the textbook states that there will not be a word that begins with CLP because we know that this is not a sound we make. Another idea that native speakers know is that we know how to formulate sentences. The textbook also gives the example of knowing that it is correct to say I have the ball instead of ball I have the. We know this because we grew up learning the language and know that you write the subject first, then the verb, and then the object. In life, whether you are a dog, fish, or even a human, communication is a dominant trait. A similarity between animal communication and human language is that each species has a mode of communication as stated in the book. For example, like the textbook states, a bird's mode of communication is through calls and songs. The mode of communication for humans is predominantly through language but also gestures. Though birds and humans have different modes, it is still a way to communicate. Another similarity is the way humans and animals are able to prevaricate. One of the discussions from class about how squirrels specifically are able to deceive other animals. A squirrel can rub snakeskin on itself to trick the snake into not being able to follow its path, much like humans are able to lie. Despite the similarities, there are also some differences. Displacement, for example, is something that only exists in human language. Animals are unable to talk about the past or future like humans can. Another difference is the reflexiveness. Humans are able to use language to talk about language, whereas animals are not able to do. Though there are differences, communication is vital within all species. There are vast differences to consider when learning about first language acquisition. Compared to second language acquisition, firstly, acquisition is the word used when a person is developing their first language, since it is innately within their genetic makeup to acquire a language. However, second language acquisition is different and requires learning it rather than innately knowing this language. To begin, when learning first language acquisition, there are two theories that are considered in language. There is the behaviorist theory and innateness hypothesis. The behaviorist theory is proposed by B.F. Skinner. The textbook discussed that his theory involved language as something that must be taught. He believed that a person learned their first language and that children started out with a blank slate and only learned through repetition and reinforcement. And also the textbook stated that parents and environment play a large role in how well a child learns the language. The innateness hypothesis was the complete opposite of the behaviorist. This was proposed by Noam Chomsky. He believed that a child is born innately with language and that a person is hardwired for it. The textbook states that Chomsky stated there is a specific language center in the brain and that environment has little to do with how a child acquires language. Second language acquisition is much different. According to the textbook, it is much easier for a person to learn second language before puberty since their corpus callosum has not hardened yet, which allows neural activity to be passed through both sides of the brain. There are several different ways to learn a second language that were discussed in class, which involve audiolingual method, community language learning, comprehension approach, Suggestopedia, silent way, and communicative approach. The audiolingual method is basically listening to the teacher and repeating, and then also learning a lot of different vocabulary. The community language learning is is more of the students leading the classroom and focusing more on speaking and fluency rather than accuracy. The comprehension approach focuses on listening and understanding the language rather than speaking. Suggestopedia is a relaxed and encouraging environment so that the students feel comfortable learning but not stressing that they learn it quickly. Silent way is more of the students teaching themselves since the teacher does not speak for 90% of the class and focuses on having students immediately learn and speak the language. And lastly, the communicative approach is equal student and teacher participation using lots of group activities and interaction with other students. There are two main parts in the brain for language, which include Broca's area and Wernicke's area. The textbook explains that Wernicke's area is the region of the brain located at the cortex of the dominant temporal lobe. It is responsible for interpreting lexical entries. The arcuate fasciculus is responsible for sending phonetic information from Wernicke's area to Broca's. Broca's area is the part of the frontal lobe and is responsible for interpreting information received from the arcuate fasciculus and transmits articulatory information to the motor cortex. The motor cortex directs movement of muscles for articulation. If there is damage to Wernicke's, it causes difficulty in comprehension. Any damage to either Broca's or Wernicke's is known as aphasia. As discussed in class, aphasia is a severe language impairment due to injury. This means that if a person has brochophagia, they are unable to produce fluent speech with good intonation. They are able to produce fluent speech with good intonation, but there is not any meaning to it. It can be grammatical, but is mostly random word substitutions or even neologisms, and they are also unable to comprehend a conversation. If there is damage to Broca's area, it causes difficulty in speech production. This means that the person can basically express the meaning, but the speech is much slower and there are much shorter sentences. Usually the speech is missing function words, and the person gets much more frustrated since they know what they want to say, but they cannot seem to articulate it, as if there is a roadblock stopping them from uttering the words. But the difference from Wernicke's is that the person can follow the conversation. There are other disorders that originate in the brain known as alexia and agraphia, which are language disorders, both caused by damage to angular gyrus. Alexia is the inability to read and comprehend written words. Agraphia is the inability to write words. Language disorders originate in the left side of the brain, since that is where language is predominant. The structure of language has many parts to it, including phonology, morphology, syntax, and grammar, among others. Phonetics refers to the way people utter words in relation to sound. There are many systems that were discussed in class that are involved in producing sound, which include lungs, trachea, vocal cords, and tongue, which with specific jobs that a word is able to be uttered. The lungs are responsible for the air that is required to speak. The trachea is where the air comes in, since it is the windpipe. Vocal cords vibrate while a person is speaking so that a sound is produced and are often referred to as vocal folds. The tongue and lips have relatively the same job, since they both help in articulating the letters. The teeth are especially helpful in articulation, since the teeth provide a place for the tongue to articulate. Textbook states when articulating a letter of the alphabet is either voiced or voiceless. Voiceless is when the vocal folds do not vibrate, whereas the vocal folds do vibrate with voice. Each letter has a different way it is articulated. It is either through place of articulation or manner of articulation. Place of articulation is the place where air is modified in the vocal tract depending where the tongue is placed and position of lips. Manner of articulation is the way the tongue, lips, velum, and glottis position themselves in different ways to produce different sounds. Morphology is the study of the elements of language. As discussed in class, morphemes are the smallest unit of meaning in a language, including a bound morpheme and a free morpheme. Free morphemes are words that can stand alone. Within a free morpheme, it is broken up even further to a lexical and functional words. A lexical is any noun, verb, adjective, or adverb, like the word shirt. Functional words are prepositions, conjunctions, and articles including in and the. Bound morphemes are words that cannot stand by themselves and attach to a free morpheme. Bound morphemes are split up as well into derivational and inflectional. Inflectional is any suffix that is found at the end of a word, and derivational is the prefix that is found at the beginning of a word. Syntax is a set of rules within a language and how to put sentences together. The two different types of grammar are prescriptive and descriptive that we discussed in class. Prescriptive grammar is the formal language rules that are taught in school, and most English teachers try to correct the student when there is an error. Descriptive grammar is the way that people speak in normal communication. Another important aspect of syntax is sentence structure. A sentence is made up by a verb phrase and a noun phrase. A noun phrase includes a determiner and a noun. A verb phrase includes a verb and a noun phrase. For example, the cat sat on the mat is a sentence because the word the is a determiner, cat is the noun, sat is the verb, on is the preposition, the is a determiner, and mat is a noun. Semantics and pragmatics both deal with the language being used. There are different ways to describe word meaning. Sense is using words to describe another word. For example, the book gives an example of mare being plus equine, plus female, plus mature, whereas a male horse is plus equine, minus female, plus mature. References are words that refer to an item in the real world, and people implicitly know what is meant when it is said. For example, the textbook gives an example of a car as a general term for a motorized vehicle. And lastly, proper nouns are names for commercial things, places, and people. It refers to particular individuals and do not denote particular qualities. There are many misconceptions about electronic mediated conversation with a mostly negative connotation. A common myth that the textbook gives is that teens are unable to switch between text talk and formal conversation settings. However, researchers have found that this is not the case. Another common myth given in the textbook is that texting has a lot to do with the decline of English, because of the various abbreviations used while texting. But the textbook states that in a Norwegian study, only 6% of people actually used abbreviations while texting. Within electronic communication, there are two different types known as synchronous and asynchronous. Synchronous form refers to the instant communicating that goes on in like an instant messenger. Asynchronous is the opposite and does not require immediate response like through email. Since texting is still something that is considered new, there are not any set rules. Most people will expect an immediate response from another person, even if they are not in a place where responding to a text would be appropriate. Texting can also send many signals to people. It can help to alleviate awkwardness. For example, being alone in an elevator with another person and texting a friend to avoid small talk. Or as the textbook states, it can also convey a message that you are bored with whom you are hanging out with, so instead you text to show you are bored. There are some rules to texting, like with all caps, suggesting either excitement, fear, or anger. It is known that on a regular basis that it is not acceptable to use all caps unless trying to convey those feelings. But what is certain is that texting is not causing a decline in English. Language is ever changing, and texting is not necessarily negatively changing the language. Language change is something that is always happening around us. Because language evolves and words either change in meaning or are completely extracted out of the language, there are new words that get adopted, and once they are used more often, it becomes a part of the vocabulary. It is normal that a language changes as society changes, and language change because of people such as social, economic, and political pressures that affect it. The many different varieties within a language also have a lot to do with the language change. A person's idiolect even has an influence on others. A language changes through semantics, phonology, and syntax. As discussed in class, changing the vocabulary either opens up the meaning of a word, narrows the meaning, has the disappearance of a word, or borrows from another language. An example from class for broadening the meaning was the example of the word holiday. It used to be known as Holy Day, which was a religious feast, but transformed into holiday, which means a day off of work. Narrowing the meaning gives a more precise word for a certain thing. Another example from class was Hund, which used to mean any type of dog, but it transformed to Hound, which is a specific breed of dog. When words disappear, they are basically booted out of the language and are no longer used, and borrowing is simply taking words from other language and adopting them within a language. Change in pronunciation deals with the different ways that words sound. Change in the syntax is given the example that there used to be a separate word for the plural suffix s. Another important aspect in language is the difference in language and dialect. If someone speaks a different language, it is not comprehensible by the other person, but a dialect is understood since it shares many features, but is different in grammar and sound and vocabulary. Every language variety is rule-governed, and no dialect is superior to another. The textbook states that African American vernacular is said to be one of the most distinct dialects and is often discriminated against. There are set rules, though, as in any other dialect. The textbook mentions a few examples from their dialects, such as double negatives being a normal part of the language, and also the habitual be within a sentence. Because some dialects are not always necessarily appropriate for formal settings, schools have been teaching standard English to children. In one video that we watched in class, the children played Jeopardy and corrected it to standard English, but the teacher made sure to preserve the children's dialect rather than having them completely abandon what they grew up speaking and giving it a negative connotation. People switch between their dialect and standard English so that they can relate to both parties at hand. When with family and friends, it is common that you speak the same dialect to feel a part of that community, and in turn you speak that dialect. But when speaking to a crowd, most people are able to alternate between their dialect and another.